The quiet didn't last long. Iran just fired ballistic missiles at a U.S. base again. Every one of them was shot down. And President Trump just told reporters exactly what comes next. This ends the first real pause in direct fighting we've seen in weeks, and it happened alongside several other developments across the region on the same day. Here's what CENTCOM has confirmed. On Tuesday evening, Iran's Revolutionary Guard launched multiple ballistic missiles from Iranian territory toward a U.S. military base in Jordan. CENTCOM described it as an attempted surprise attack, saying the missiles were fired at 5:45 p.m. Eastern Time. Every incoming missile was intercepted and destroyed before reaching its target, according to CENTCOM, with no reported casualties or damage to U.S. forces. The IRGC's aerospace force claimed responsibility directly, saying in a statement that it had targeted the Muwafaq Salti Air Base and the headquarters of U.S. Central Command in Jordan, in response to what it called aggressive actions by the U.S. military. Muwafaq Salti isn't a new name in this war. The same base was struck in a deadlier attack earlier in July that killed 2 American soldiers, an incident we covered in detail at the time, which makes it one of the most repeatedly targeted single locations of this entire conflict. There's a detail worth flagging here, the same way we flag every casualty and count discrepancy in this war. Jordan's own military said its air defenses intercepted 5 missiles. CNN separately reported that 4 ballistic missiles were fired in the attack. Neither figure has been reconciled publicly as of this recording, and it's the kind of minor but real inconsistency that shows up constantly in fast-moving reporting on this conflict. Sources close to Iran also claimed multiple explosions were heard inside Jordan and circulated images allegedly showing impact sites, claims that have not been independently verified. This attack didn't happen in a vacuum. It came after roughly 4 days of relative calm, following Trump's decision last Friday to pause U.S. strikes on Iran and give diplomacy a chance, a pause we covered in an earlier update, one that itself followed 13 consecutive nights of U.S. strikes on Iranian territory. Tuesday's missiles mark the first publicly disclosed attack on American forces in the region since that pause began. Throughout the earlier 13-night campaign, Iran had responded to nearly every round of U.S. strikes by firing one-way attack drones and missiles at American bases across the Gulf region, including in Kuwait, Jordan, Bahrain, and Qatar, a pattern that makes Tuesday's attack look less like an isolated event and more like a resumption of that same retaliatory cycle after a brief interruption. The timing relative to something else we've covered is also notable. The attack came just hours after Trump met with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu at the White House, their first in-person meeting since the 2 countries launched joint strikes against Iran back on February 28th. Now here's what Trump actually said in response. Speaking to reporters, Trump said, "So it's our turn," adding that the U.S. would see whether an agreement between the 2 nations was still possible, but we're going to hit them very hard. He told Fox News Wednesday morning that U.S. troops had only minutes to shoot down the incoming missiles. In a separate interview with Axios given the day before this attack, Trump said the U.S. was in very deep talks with Iran, while warning he'd return to very strong military action if diplomacy failed. Asked how much time he was willing to give negotiations, he said, "Not much time. Either it goes fast or not at all." The same day brought developments beyond Jordan. Trump said he'd been briefed on a drone strike that hit a U.S.-owned gas storage tanker at the port of Damietta in Egypt on the Mediterranean coast, calling it a little more of the same without elaborating further. No group has publicly claimed responsibility for that specific strike as of this recording, and Trump's own comment stopped short of attributing it directly to Iran, leaving the tanker incident as a separate, still unexplained thread running alongside the more clearly attributed attack in Jordan. Separately, American and Saudi fighter aircraft struck multiple logistics and weapons sites in eastern Iraq in response to alleged drone attacks on Saudi Arabia. Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces, a coalition of Iran-backed armed groups operating under nominal Iraqi military command, said at least 20 of its fighters were killed and 32 wounded in those overnight strikes. The UAE separately reported its own air defenses intercepting a barrage of Iranian ballistic missiles during this same general window, a reminder that Tuesday's activity wasn't confined to a single country. Trump also addressed a separate Reuters report the same day about Iran reportedly expecting to receive an initial shipment of up to 400 Chinese-made shoulder-fired air defense missile launchers. He said such a development would be surprising, without confirming or denying the substance of the report itself. That comment adds a third country, China, into the same news cycle as a potential supplier of military equipment to Iran, a claim that remains at the level of an unconfirmed Reuters report rather than a confirmed transfer as of this recording. There was also a domestic political thread running alongside all of this. House Speaker Mike Johnson said Tuesday that he would not use the War Powers Act against the Trump administration over the ongoing conflict, instead calling on NATO and Middle Eastern allies to take on a larger role. That's a notable choice, since the War Powers Act is the specific mechanism Congress has available if it wants to formally challenge a president's authority to continue military action without new authorization, and choosing not to use it signals continued congressional deference to the administration's handling of this war, at least from Republican leadership. That decision stands in contrast to an earlier congressional vote we've covered, when the House passed a narrower resolution directing a troop withdrawal by a margin of just 6 votes, showing that support for continuing this war isn't uniform even within a Congress that isn't currently invoking its strongest formal tool to challenge it. Johnson's call for NATO and Middle Eastern allies to take a larger role also raises its own question, since it isn't accompanied by any specific commitment from those allies as of this recording, making it more of a stated preference than a confirmed shift in how the burden of this war is being shared. So what does Tuesday actually change? Start with the obvious point. A 4-day pause in direct strikes between the US and Iran has now ended, at least in terms of Iran initiating an attack on American forces. Whether the US responds with renewed strikes on Iranian territory or treats this as an isolated incident within an otherwise continuing diplomatic track is the open question Trump's own comments don't fully answer. His language, "it's our turn," paired with "we're going to hit them very hard," reads as a clear signal of intent. But this war has included similar strong statements before that weren't always followed immediately by matching military action, something we've tracked in earlier updates, including a separate ultimatum earlier this year that was itself postponed days after being issued when Trump cited what he called productive conversations with Tehran. That history doesn't tell us what happens this time, but it does mean strong rhetoric on its own hasn't been a reliable predictor of the scale or timing of the military response that follows it throughout this specific conflict. There's also a reasonable case that Tuesday's attack was more symbolic than materially damaging, given that every missile was intercepted and CENTCOM reported no casualties or damage. That doesn't make the attack insignificant, since an attempted surprise attack on a base hosting American forces carries real risk regardless of whether the interception succeeds. But it does mean the physical outcome of Tuesday's specific attack differs from some of the deadlier incidents we've covered earlier in this war, including the Jordan attack in July that killed 2 American soldiers. Successful interception also carries its own strategic message, demonstrating that U.S. and allied air defense systems in the region can reliably stop this kind of attack, even when Iran describes it as a surprise, which may factor into how much pressure Tuesday's attack actually generates compared to an attack that had caused real casualties or damage. The claims that haven't been verified deserve equal attention to the ones that have. Iran's own account, delivered through IRGC statements and sources, described only as close to the Islamic Republic, includes details, explosions heard inside Jordan, images of alleged impact sites that stand in direct contrast to CENTCOM's account of a fully intercepted attack with no damage. Both of those accounts can't be fully accurate at the same time, and neither has been independently confirmed by a neutral third party as of this recording. That's not unusual for this war, but it's worth naming directly, rather than picking whichever version fits a preferred narrative. The same standard we've applied to disputed claims from every side of this conflict, whether they come from CENTCOM, Iranian state media, or officials in any of the other countries now touched by this war. Here's where this leaves things. Iran fired multiple ballistic missiles at a U.S. base in Jordan on Tuesday evening, in what CENTCOM called an attempted surprise attack, with every missile intercepted and no reported casualties or damage. Jordan and CNN have reported slightly different missile counts that haven't been reconciled. The attack ended a roughly 4-day pause in direct hostilities and came hours after Trump's first in-person meeting with Netanyahu since the war began. Trump has said the U.S. will hit back very hard while separately describing ongoing deep talks with Iran that he says have limited time left to succeed. The same day brought a drone strike on U.S.-linked infrastructure in Egypt, U.S. and Saudi strikes in Iraq that killed at least 20 fighters, an unconfirmed report about Chinese-made air defense equipment potentially reaching Iran, and a decision by House leadership not to formally challenge the administration's authority to continue this war. Each of those threads is moving somewhat independently of the others right now. Strikes in one country, diplomacy referenced in another conversation, a funding and equipment question in a third, which is part of why this war has become harder to summarize in a single sentence the longer it continues. We're not going to guess whether Tuesday's attack restarts sustained fighting or ends up as an isolated incident inside an otherwise continuing pause. But we do want to ask you, when a president says it's our turn right after a diplomatic pause breaks down, does that read to you as the war reigniting or as one more escalation in a pattern this conflict has repeated several times already? And what would actually change your answer over the next few days?